Welcome to another of our Wednesday yachting luncheons. Usually we look out these windows and we see all the way across to Marin, but it's still beautiful. No matter what we see out there, it's incredible that we can be right here on the water. A little bit about future speakers. You want to stop by on March 28th. We'll be listening to Jocelyn Nash. You will recall she won in 1965 the men's sailing championship, amateur sailing championship, the Mallory Cup. She's a woman, of course, and she won it with our boy, Jimmy DeWitt. On March 21st, R.C. Keefe will be by to talk about proper yachting history of the St. Francis Yacht Club. On March 14th, Philip Eliasov, one of the world's authorities on Winslow Homer, will be talking about American spirit in the 19th century. Winslow Homer paints Manifest Destiny. David Holscher will be here to talk about swimming to and back from the Farallones on March the 8th. How many people have swum to and back from the Farallones? Lots of hands. I can see those hands. Tom Wiley, I know you did it. Dessenberg, I know you did it. On the 28th of February, Charlie Walther will be here to talk about how hybrid vessels can help the bluest oceans get greener. We'll hear from Tom Eamon on Sailing Illustrated on the 14th. He'll be talking all about the America's Cup here on February 14th. On February 7th, former governor of the Federal Reserve Board and System, Bob Heller, will be here to talk about the challenges facing the new chairman of the Federal Reserve. Let's see. And then on the 31st of this month, we'll hear from Bill Keener on the fascinating return of whales and dolphins and porpoises in San Francisco Bay. It's quite an amazing thing that we're seeing whales in the bay again these days. He'll explain why. And the new game of drone footage, photography footage over water will be explained on January 24th when Anthony Scapozzi, a young drone pilot who's making his living as a drone pilot. Imagine that's now a new profession. He'll be here to talk about how he's doing it and show us his techniques and technology and so on. And next week, on this coming week, we'll be hearing from John McNeil, who'll be talking to us about the yacht Yankee. Those of you who've seen Yankee know that she was built in 1906 right across the way from us in Stoneboat Yard, just upon and got her christening at the earthquake. No kidding. As the earthquake came, she fell off and almost went in the water. So, now a little bit about our speaker today. Normally, I will introduce our speaker, but today I'm going to introduce somebody to introduce the speaker. And that person's a longtime buddy of mine and the speaker. Mary Crowley first sailed when she was a 4-year-old in a little 26-foot sailboat, and since then has accumulated about 71,000 ocean sailing miles. She founded in 1979 Ocean Voyages. We know Ocean Voyages to be really the premier sort of ocean cruising and yacht chartering business around the world. She has now taken 50,000 travelers on thousands of trips around the world. And on her nonprofit side, she started a Project Kaisei some decade or so ago. And since that time, they have picked up from the ocean and accumulated and taken out of the ocean 20,000 tons of plastic garbage. And so please welcome Mary Crowley of Ocean Voyages to introduce David.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here and to introduce David, who I was lucky enough to spend a lot of time with at the UN Ocean Conference last June. It was a real pleasure being with David and with his associate Joseph Robertson, because we all shared a passion for that conference and what was going on. And at the conference, it was widely noted that our ocean ecosystem is the ecosystem that's in the most trouble. And it was wonderful, as somebody who cares deeply about oceans, and the three of us all do, to be there and to see that sort of attention. So to go on to David's background, he, like many of you, has been on adventures most of his life. He bicycled all over the U.S., Canada, and New Zealand, and then he discovered yachting. Well, he started yachting as a little boy. His mother was a great sailor. So he got back and has become really expert on the polar regions. He and the crew of Cloud9, several of his shipmates are here, were the first American sailors in history to transit the Northwest Passage from the east to the west. And then in 2009, sailing aboard Ocean Watch, which was here at the club, many of you may remember, David became the only American sailor to ever navigate the Northwest Passage in both directions. So David has many accomplishments. It's an honor to share his photographic talent and his passion for our oceans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, for that lovely introduction, and thank you, Ron, so much, and all of you for being here today. What a wonderful turnout, and I do have to make a little shout out to my Okoboji, Iowa friends who are here all the way from Iowa, but also living in the Bay Area, and yes, we do have water and sailing in Iowa, for those of you who don't know, and also I want to give a special shout out to my friends and mates, Douglas Finley and Chris Parkman, who are here. We sailed through the Northwest Passage together in 2007, and many of you know them, and they're very accomplished sailors and fine gentlemen and very brave men also. Thank you very much for being here today, you guys. So, wow, looking outside today, it kind of looked like going through the Northwest Passage. I couldn't see a thing, a lot of fog, and maybe an iceberg coming through that fog or something, but that's what we faced a lot of the time up there. Today I'm going to tell a few stories, and I also will be speaking initially for my friend Joseph Robertson, who couldn't be here today, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Geoversiv Foundation, a foundation that he founded and I work with now, and that's who I was representing at the United Nations this summer, and much of what I'm doing right now. My friend Joe is an economist and got into the climate issues about 10 years ago, and he's exploring how to change the world through economics and as if the earth really mattered. And I've been sort of the guy on the ground who's been out there ground truthing what's happening in the world, and we've kind of met in the middle and found a really nice happy medium in which to explore right now. And what we really truly believe in is science, and science is kind of under assault right now, and that's why I have thrown that quote up there, because it really doesn't matter what you believe or not. Science will guide us into sound policy right now, and that's where we're moving. So I'll kind of begin my program. I am a professional photographer, and I hope you enjoy the images today. I'll try to move fairly quickly, and then we'll get into some fun questions, which I really enjoy. This is my friend Joe Robertson. This was at the National Press Club last year when we announced our global status update, and Joe really launched the foundation, and we've been working hard ever since. Joe's really active. He was active in the Paris Climate Agreement, and we worked with a number of people to send policy there to help formulate that agreement, and he's active in COP23, COP24, and he was just at the One World Summit with President Macron. And I just have a couple slides here that he wanted to put in, because he's also an explorer. And we really have been, I guess, very motivated and inspired by space. And I grew up, I'm a young baby boomer, and I was really inspired by the environmental movement, starting from looking at our little planet Earth from out in space and understanding that we're very vulnerable. So this is something that's inspired both of us. And of course, through exploration, this is how we learn about our limits, and hopefully we can become better world builders by seeing what we can do and accomplish. The other thing is Joe goes to all of these things around the world. I'm pretty new at going to all the UN events and stuff, but Joe is at almost every one. And this is what he does. So he's working the policy side, and then we have a lot of us that are working from, like me, who's an explorer, and we have scientists and NASA people and different folks. So this is what Joe does, and I'm not going to get into a whole lot of his economics, but he believes that we really need all hands on deck right now. Okay, and we need to empower people all over the planet because we never know who's going to take us out of this predicament that we find ourselves in these days. And it could be that 3-year-old girl that's living impoverished in a mud hut in Yemen. We have to make sure that these children have the best opportunities to be able to help change the world and have the same kind of opportunities that I've had as a young boy growing up. And along these lines, and with Mary, I might add, these are our 10 goals that we believe in for our ocean neutrality initiative that we've launched, and number 1 being plastic waste. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more. But these are some of the issues that we've all been working on. They're very new issues in some cases, like ocean acidification, for instance, which many of you are familiar with. It's sort of the evil twin of climate change. And again, I'm happy to answer individual questions later on about any of these issues. But this is what we're working hard on. We're forming many relationships around the world, and Mary is one of them with her projects with the Ocean Voyages Institute. And we're going to be collaborating on some projects together, and this will involve space, satellites, microsatellites, CubeSats, drones, going out into the gyre and reporting from right on the ground. So we're trying to combine all of these in an open source platform in order to do big, quick changes and supply people with data sets that they can use in the field. So that's a little bit about what we're working on, but this is really why we're here, is to talk about ocean conservation, because plastics are taking over our oceans right now. And of course, we used to think of our ocean currents as a way to travel around the world. They were our highways. But now what they are is highways of transportation to the debris that we're creating on land. So this interface and this connection between land and ocean and human action is so prevalent right now. Of course, this is some of Mary's work and what she's doing out in the gyre right now with her projects, and it's just so important because this plastic is not just on the surface. It goes all the way down through the water column as it's broken down over time. So it's 30,000 feet down into our ocean all the way to the bottom, and forming a toxic soup there on the base of the ocean floor, and it's penetrating ocean life. So it's a problem that we're tackling. There's lots of ideas out there, and it's really time to act. So this is just some of what you see as the problem. I know many of you have seen images like this over the years, and this ghost net situation is really horrible, where a lot of the fishing gear is getting tangled up all over marine life, especially big migrating whales like this in the image. So that's a little intro on Joe Robertson, and I'm really sorry he couldn't be here to explain some of his economics, which I'm sure you're very interested in hearing. But I'm going to tell you some sailing stories. So this is my book, Over the Horizon, and about exploring these edges and kind of what I've been doing the last 20 years. And this is one of my favorite photos from the Arctic Ocean, off Point Barrow, blowing 35, 40 knots, lingering gale, and small craft advisory along the coast. And as I always say, a perfect day to be sailing on Cloud 9. So nice day for me to be shooting pictures out there, and one of my favorite photographs of the ocean. So, think about this. Where were you and when did you fall in love with the water or the ocean? Well, for me, it was in Iowa. And this is Little Lake Okoboji. I was born here in California, but my parents moved back, and we went to school and grew up in Iowa. But these are the Iowa Great Lakes, nestled into the farmland in northern Iowa, right on the Minnesota border, and they're glacier lakes. They were created by the receding glaciers some 15,000 years ago, and so they were created by the natural cycle of climate change as the glaciers receded from this ice age. And so it's a natural fit for me to have become involved in both climate science and learning to sail on a little glacial lake. And this is where we grew up and we live and recreate, and beautiful bird life like you have in your marshlands around here. And I became a photographer and love the water and have been an environmentalist and a water quality advocate for as long as I can remember. But it's because of our clean water and our initiatives that we do there in Iowa that we have in a county of 17,000 people a $300 million tourism industry. So this is how important clean resources are to sound economies and how you can build an economy based on sound, clean resources. And so I started following this water cycle years ago and connecting it from the Midwest of the United States to our oceans. So here's our farming community, right? Now we have greater increased rain, and it's increased more than 3 inches in the last 2 decades because of our changing climate and more water vapor in the atmosphere. So we're having heavier rains. It's washing off our fields of sediment and nitrates into our water systems. We have 750 imperiled bodies of water in the state of Iowa. These continue downstream, fouling our waters in our lakes and rivers, and eventually this is what happens. And this is how I really connect what's happening on the land with what's happening in the ocean. So you can see that Iowa is right in the middle of this monstrous drainage area that ends up in the Mississippi River and down into the Gulf of Mexico, and has created this hypoxic dead zone, which is expanding rapidly now. And so when I speak to kids a lot, it's really hard to visualize what a changing climate looks like. You can't look up in the sky and say, oh yeah, there's more CO2, or into the ocean and say, oh, there's ocean acidification. But you can certainly see how one farm or an accumulation can start having problems within our big system. So whether it's plastics, whether it's nitrates, whether it's sediments, whether it's CO2, we are maxing out our resources on planet Earth, and at some point this is going to be an overwhelming cost that we're going to have to tackle. So my message is, let's tackle it now, and let's remain active and involved and solving problems so that we can have a renewable future and more great jobs for our kids in this next generation to come. Well, my beginnings really go back to sailing. I think Mary's from Chicago. Is that where you learned to first sail? So we have a lot of Midwestern sailors here that started in the Midwest on lakes. And for me, it was no difference. I was in Okoboji, and my mom taught me how to sail as a little boy. This is my little X-boat. You can barely see on the back the name of my boat was Help, upside down, with an exclamation point. So that's me sailing the boat. My mom on the right there, who was a great sailor in her own right, as was my grandfather. And they still sail to this day. Little kids are sailing. My wife's been involved in the sailing school program there. So we've had a real active water life for almost all of our lives growing up around the lakes. And I continued to photograph sailing and became involved with some boat makers and scow sailors like Buddy Melgus over the years, and North Sails, doing a lot of work for them. And at some point this sort of dawned on me that my sailing and my photography could be the vehicles to help me achieve my boyhood goal of sailing around the world. And that's what I started to do. But you know what? You have to have a mentor. And my mentor lived 35 miles away across the border in Minnesota, was a southern Minnesota hog farmer named Roger Swanson. And he's literally the person that took me to the sea, and maybe a few others in this room. Roger sailed over 200,000 miles, won the Blue Water Medal, as recognized as one of the finest offshore sailors. Also was recognized as the finest offshore voyager of the last 3 decades by Cruising World magazine. So a really fine mentor to have, and it was really fun to go visit him up on his farm in Minnesota, as you can imagine. He took over 200 different people sailing with him over the years and introduced a lot of us to the oceans on his beautiful boat, Catch Cloud 9. This was a photograph from Tuktoyaktuk in the Canadian Arctic. When I'm speaking to kids, I always call this Tuk Toyota Truck, because it's a lot easier to say to the kids like that. But you can see how fine the boat was kept all the time. in ship shape because Roger was an old Navy seaman, and we did everything by the book. And Roger was a fine CCA member over the years. Roger gave me the opportunity to go sail all over the planet, 45,000 miles together. This was my first trip across the southern Atlantic from Cape Town, South Africa to Ushuaia, Argentina, and I was hanging upside down off the top of the mast to get the shot. It was really fun stuff. And of course, this was in southern Chile, in the fjords there, some of which weren't even named on our charts. We called this one Biotimbalis, or the Bay of the Kettle Drums, because there were 3 glaciers that kept calving off in the distance, and they would just rumble like kettle drums. So Roger introduced me to many of these beautiful elements, as you can see, like sailing in the snow and ice. And this is me in Antarctica a number of years ago when we sailed down there. We also were one of the first vessels, I think the first private yacht ever to sail below the U.S. vessel to sail below the Antarctic Circle, and we just got hammered down there by storms that lasted for days on end, and probably the closest that I've ever been in my sailing career to losing it. And Roger would have said the same thing. We had tremendous weather down there, winds up to 70, 80 knots with calving icebergs all around us, a very dangerous time. And we lost most of our power and instruments, and the warmest we could get our boat was 37 degrees at the time, and we were pretty soaked. But the U.S. scientific base of Palmer Station was a good respite for us down there. You see lots of crazy things from wall clouds and roll clouds and cigar clouds and fronts coming through and at you. This was in the Southern Ocean, and lots of fun wave action to sail through and survive. We had 105 knots at Cape Horn, 80 knots sailing in the Drake Passage, and a boat dismasted near us, a New Zealand vessel. So lots of great adventures in high wind and seas. Together we sailed down to Antarctica, like I said, first in 1991, 92, and this was the first iceberg that I ever saw at sea to photograph. Just massive and monstrous and wonderful things to see on nice days, but they are the devil on of the rough days where they're calving off ice and sending the bergy bits out there in the sea at you, which you have to dodge, that are about the size of this room and bobbing around in the ocean. Of course, when we were down in Antarctica, this was the first time that I got to get out with the scientists from the U.S. scientific base at Palmer Station, and I really fell in love with working with scientists and then telling the stories, and like of these Adelie penguins now, who are very much threatened by the warming Antarctic peninsula, and should definitely investigate the Adelie penguins and how they're trying to adapt to these new changing conditions. But it was during this time, you can see Cloud 9 down there in the corner in the lower left. Of course, to get this picture, I didn't have a drone at the time in 1992, so I had to hike basically up the other side of a glacier that looked like this in order to get that picture. So you have to put yourself in a little bit of danger sometimes in order to get photographs to kind of set the place. But it was during this time that we were in Antarctica that Roger, of course, we hadn't even left Antarctica, and he started talking about the Northwest Passage. So in the summer of 1994, we had positioned Cloud 9 on the east coast of the United States in Nova Scotia, and this is where we would base out of in order to attempt the Northwest Passage for the first time. So the Northwest Passage goes up out into the Atlantic, around the ice edge. There's lots of icebergs in here. So you get around the ice edge, up the west coast of Greenland, and into the Canadian archipelago of islands, over the top of the whole continent of North America, through the Bering Strait here, where I could see Russia out my window, and then down into the Aleutian Islands, and finally into Kodiak or the Pacific. And of course, this is something that had never been done by any American sailors in history, especially in 1994. It kind of looks like this in action. Up the west coast of Greenland, across Baffin Bay over the Arctic Circle at about 74, 75 degrees north, into the Canadian archipelago of islands, and then you head south. This is the nuts and bolts of the passage, and then over the entire top of North America and hopefully into the Pacific Ocean. And as Cloud 9 was beating along, it sort of looked like this. And if you were looking out the window earlier, you would see that it looked very much like this outside. We have a lot of foggy conditions up there because the temperature of the water and the air is very similar. So in 1994, we took off, and this is kind of what it looked like, right? A lot of snow and ice on the boat, a lot of fog, but eventually we got to Greenland. And of course, Greenland's one of the most beautiful places on the planet. Even on gray days, there were blue icebergs like this. We dodged a lot of bergy bits as we worked up the coast as the ice was clearing out of Baffin Bay. So you work up north, stage by stage, until you get to about 74 degrees north. On the nice days, you could stop and look at icebergs, get beautiful pictures. And as I say, this is my friend Jeff Pope, who is not with us anymore in the bow there. He was 81 years old at the time when we went to the passage, and he was quite an adventurer, a Minnesotan. He was in the Guinness Book of World Records for undertaking the longest canoe trip ever in history, 7,700 miles, in 1937 from New York City to Nome, Alaska, with a friend, and they portaged the whole thing. So pretty amazing person. And he had lots of adventures. He hitched on trains, and he once said he won 37 cents at a keynote table and quit while he was ahead back in the day. So he was quite a storyteller. Again, perspective. This was really fun to pass by icebergs. Somebody's making a nice latte for me, maybe. And so this is great. Jakobshavn Glacier, this is the most productive glacier in North America, produces 10% of all the icebergs in the Northern Hemisphere, probably the iceberg that sunk the Titanic. Produces enough fresh water daily to supply New York City with its annual freshwater supply. It's also the fastest moving and fastest receding glacier in the Northern Hemisphere now, and studied very much by scientists, and Greenland is a key factor in the Earth's climate and sea level rise right now. So we stopped in these beautiful little villages in Greenland and really had fun exploring the coast of West Greenland, which I would highly suggest traveling to. And of course, finally we got up to see the rock outcrop in the background, and that's called Devil's Thumb, and that's a landmark that is the place where you would like to leave to cross Baffin Bay and go over to Canada. So at that perfect time, we split the pack ice, of course, nice sailing day there. And the pack ice generally splits along this line. There's a northern pack ice and there's a middle pack in Baffin Bay. It splits, and as soon as that split takes place, then you can cross over into northern Canada. And that's what we did. We had big following seas, but we made a fast passage, and this is our actual chart. You can see there how we headed across Baffin Bay and into Lancaster Sound, and this is where the Northwest Passage begins. And you know you're not in for a warm summer of sailing, of course, when you see these types of clouds on the entry, and we weren't quite sure what we were in for because this was uncharted territory for us in 1994. Remember, no computers, no sat phones, none of the stuff. It was kind of old school exploring at the time, and it got really old school once we got to Erebus Bay and met the remains of the Sir John Franklin expedition from 1845. And these were the first 3 sailors who died from that expedition. All 129 men would perish. Typical British expedition, you know, too big of vessels, too many men, bad clothing, and poor food. So pretty much typical. But, and of course they didn't want to accept any help from the indigenous peoples. So, you know, exploration was a little bit different at the time. You'll notice that we have a second vessel with us. There's a smaller vessel there. This was a boat named Back of the Moon. So in 1994, there were exactly 2 sailboats and 9 people attempting the Northwest Passage in the world at the time. So we decided we would go on together. Now, we didn't want to end up like the Franklin expedition, of course, but the Franklin expedition did inspire a lot of people to go back and look for the passage and look for the demise of the expedition. But we got stuck in the ice really bad in '94, and the pack ice was just tremendous in that year. You can see how we're sort of anchored to these ice flows right near shore. This was a grounded ice flow here, so I would jump up on the ice and burrow in an ice climbing screw, and we would just tie up to the ice and try to survive and hang in there. and hope that we would get a lead, which we never did get, because this is what the pack ice looked like in 1994, pretty much impenetrable, and we couldn't even get south into any of the channels, either Peel Sound or Prince Regent Inlet, and you would have needed an icebreaker to penetrate this ice. So we drifted with the ice. We tried many times to get south, and every time we seemed to get in a worse position. It was hard to even get photographs because we were just kind of locked in the ice, and I had go bags with much of my equipment and film and video tucked away in case we needed to send out a mayday to hop onto an ice floe and get rescued. Eventually, what we had to do on every expedition, there's a go day and a no-go, and we hit our no-go date, and we were informed by the Canadian Coast Guard that if we went north, we would hit a shore lead and we could retreat. So that's what we did, 3,000-mile retreat with our tails between our legs, and of course the Northwest Passage had won again. Now, time passed, and in 2007, Roger was now 75 years old, and he really wanted to do the Northwest Passage. And so we assembled the crew, and it wasn't easy, I might add. Ask Doug and Chris about the backstory here. But it was a really tough trip. Roger was having some health issues at the time, and it was just a tough go. But something had changed. And in this time between 94 and 2007, I had been tracking ice because now we did have computers and the internet. I was able to get the same kind of information that the Canadian Ice Service was getting, and the scientists who were studying the northern polar ice cap were suggesting there was less ice. And I was seeing the trend, so I decided I wanted to blog, photograph, and document and ground truth what was happening and what the scientists were saying about less ice in the Arctic. So off we went again. That was Chris, by the way, on watch with the binocs there in the last image. Up the west coast of Greenland. This time it was not any kind of sightseeing cruise, and Roger had said that in an email. We were going to make the big push, and we were going to go. And finally we got up to Permafrost, Greenland on the west coast. This was our last staging area. There's a Norwegian boat next to us who had spent a lot of time in the Arctic, so we got some great information from the captain. Of course, Chris was up in the rigging trying to fix our radar unit, which wasn't working. And as we found out, never really did work until it was replaced in Cambridge Bay. So we kind of had false security as we were going across in the fog, and icebergs were coming right out of the fog at us, which we weren't seeing on the radar, and it was quite a series of events that we had crossing Baffin Bay at the time. So there's Chris in the fog, and that's kind of what it looked like. But this time when we went across Baffin Bay, there really wasn't any pack ice. The pack ice had completely disintegrated. So there were icebergs out there, but we really didn't have to worry about any pack ice at the time at all. We entered Lancaster Sound, and this is what we had. We had absolutely no ice at all going into Lancaster Sound. And by the time we kind of arrived back at where we were before, this is what we met. And so we're just a few miles here from where we had been in 1994, and this time there was no ice to greet us whatsoever. We went and anchored in here and took a little break for a while and then proceeded down Peel Sound, and even the polar bears were confused that we saw because they were probably wondering where their next meal was going to come from, because the ice was receding offshore and they were probably going to have to swim for it. And we didn't want to be their next meal, so we got out of there quickly. This time, though, we had a clear shot, clear run all the way down Peel Sound, and we were pretty happy at the time, as you can imagine, and we had a clean shot all the way into Joahaven. So now we were on Amundson's trail. So we were following the direct path of Roald Amundsen, who was the first successful captain and crew to ever go through the Northwest Passage on his boat, Joa. And this is Joahaven. This is where Joa overwintered for 2 seasons from 1903 and 1904 during their Northwest Passage. They took 4 years and were frozen in for 3 seasons in the Northwest Passage. But they called this the finest little harbor in the world, and we dropped anchor in almost the exact same position nearly 100 years later. And this was a very, very special place for us, and we were very honored to be there. And by the way, we found a lot of locals who thought that they were related to Roald Amundsen for some reason. I don't know. the two years that Amundsen was frozen in the ice there, I think were productive years. So anyway, there's a nice little settlement there now, and we were very happy to meet some of the locals and have a nice time there in Joy Haven. We proceeded on from there. This is what it looked like a lot. There's Chris on watch. Not a lot of pictures of Doug because I was on the other watch schedule as we pushed through. And Chris and I were on watch together and spent a lot of time chatting, and it was surreal. We had a lot of calm days, of course, 24/7 light, and we did a lot of motoring because there was not a lot of wind and a big high pressure up there that year, but not a lot of ice for us. And I took this photograph to illustrate that at a point in time when we got through and crossed the Arctic Circle again, we became the first American sailors in history to do the east-west, northwest passage. It was a great honor, but I felt like there should be an asterisk by our names because the area was greatly affected by a changing climate. We sailed almost 6,600 miles and never touched one piece of ice during this journey. So something had changed dramatically in the Northwest Passage. And this is an ice chart from the satellite data since our satellites were launched in 1978. And you can see there was Cloud 9 in 1994 when I first went. And the ice had been tracking between this kind of 7, 8, 9 million square kilometers for, well, the last hundreds or thousands of years, as scientists know. And all of a sudden things started changing. And by the time Cloud 9 went in 2007 and went through, we had lost 40% of our northern polar ice pack in just 13 years. And you can see in 2012, there was another tipping point, and we set another new record. Scientists had to create a new graph because it actually fell off the graph. And now we find our ice hovering right around this 4 million square kilometer mark. And this is where we sit right now. And by volume, we've lost over 50% of our northern polar ice cap. So we're heading to ice-free summers right now. It may happen still in my lifetime. I expect it to. Nothing is suggesting that it's going the other way. It's a big trend as Arctic temperatures continue to increase. So you can see just by the decades how the ice is receding. But this has stimulated a lot of interest in the Arctic, a lot of sailboats going up there, and sailboats are now part of recording and documenting what's happening. There's a lot of citizen scientists that are involved in the sailing community, and this is something that I'm very excited about in the future, and hopefully we can talk about that in some questions. And here's what's happening to the Arctic temperatures. In some places, Arctic temperatures have increased by 8 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 10 to 20 years. So the Arctic is the canary in the coal mine of our changing climate worldwide, and it's definitely the most interesting place on Earth to me. And if there's a place to save ocean by ocean, Mary's really concerned about the Pacific, as am I, but I'm really concerned about the Arctic Ocean because it's the least known ocean on our planet and the least studied. And I hate to see it ruined and exploited before we even have a chance to know it. So that's part of my mission. That sent me into a new series of studies and expeditions, and I'll kind of get through this as quickly as I can. We'll get to some questions. Many of you may have seen Ocean Watch here a few years back on the Around the Americas expedition in 2009 and 10. And I was really looking for other sailors and scientists, people that had the same kind of commitment as me to help save the world's oceans and study them and also inspire children all around the Americas. We stopped in 13. Oh, wow. There's coffee spilling on my cord. That's hilarious. So you can see our beautiful spinnaker there. That was provided by North Sails, one of our sponsors, and that was sailing in the Juneau area. So we worked with NASA and NOAA scientists, MIT, different marine schools as we traveled around the Americas in both continents. And we had about 8,000 or 10,000 kids that we were with to get them on the boat and in classrooms and try to educate and inspire them to become the next educators or scientists. And that's a mission that I've continued since that time. So this is some of what we were doing. That was me up on the upper left there with some disabled kids on the USS Intrepid Power One program in New York City. And on and on. We were part of an international Arctic buoy program and studying climate change and looking at lots of different whales. And there's our map of where we were from Seattle. We went west to east through the Northwest Passage, all the way through the Atlantic, around Cape Horn, and back up to Seattle. It took about 400 days, 28,000 miles, 13 countries, 50 port stops, and 10,000 kids, and lots of conversations. So it was a great, great voyage, and I'm honored to have been on that, especially with David Rockefeller, who's a huge advocate for ocean and sea issues and really wants sailors to be more involved in conservation issues. Of course, this was Ocean Watch. Carbon fiber kayaks on the stern, Google camera on the right. Took 50,000 images a day. We had satellite communication, lots of great equipment on board. And of course, lots of school children, as I said. And there's Ocean Watch taking off, ready to head out into the Gulf of Alaska. We had through-hull water quality monitoring 24/7, even in these conditions, and we were actually looking for carbon sinks in this area as we were sailing through this rough water. But I was always out there taking pictures, and I promised my lovely wife, Kirsty, I would be clipped in all the time, so I was. And you can see the line going up to the bow, and I was always clipped in as I was shooting pictures outdoors. We hit the ice edge up around Point Barrow. Not a lot of ice. We got into Barrow pretty easily. And, of course, there's no real good harbor there in Barrow, so we had to anchor either in the Chukchi Sea or the Beaufort Sea, depending on the way the wind was blowing. We were there about 2 weeks waiting for the ice, and during that time we were with scientists taking a look at what they were having to do in coastal communities like here in Barrow, where they're having to build resiliency into their shorelines because the permafrost is melting. And, of course, without the ice there to buffer the wave action, you get a tidal change, a storm surge, wave action, no ice, and it's tearing their coastlines apart. And they're built right next to the shore, so they're having to build in new resiliency into these communities in order to survive. We took a look at bowhead whales. We were with the foremost bowhead whale scientists, and I might add Inuit bowhead whale hunters who led their communities, and they've worked together in order to bring the bowhead whale back from the brink of extinction. And here's some bowhead whales migrating along the coast from the Bering Strait around Point Barrow and into their summer grounds in the Beaufort Sea. And I threw this in also because I'm working with different conservation groups, and these are simulated oil spills now that oil leasing is going on within the Arctic and along the coastal plain of Alaska. And you can see this would be a simulated Chukchi Sea oil spill right through the migratory route of where all of the animals, their summer habitat where they breed. There's millions and millions of birds. There's the bowhead whales, polar bears, seals, walrus, everything. And this interface between the land and the ice is this is their habitat. And this is also where drilling would take place. So there's over a 70% chance of an oil spill occurring if there is oil development up there. And it's an area that I'm committed to helping protect, and I'll be setting up base camp in the Arctic this summer in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to help educate and bring awareness to the issue. So I'll be in this 1002 area of the coastal plain of Alaska this summer, and also interviewing a lot of indigenous people. So I plan to be there for the summer solstice and most of June and maybe beyond, depending on what happens up there. So this is an area that I'm very much committed to and helping to protect. There's lots of different animals there, like sandhill cranes, which I photograph in Nebraska, but they're also up there on the coast of Alaska. Lots of caribou, and I'll be photographing and filming the caribou migration this summer. This is my friend Richard Speener from the Alaska Wilderness League that I'm working with on this project. And of course, we don't want the people, we forget there's people that live up there, we don't want them to be refugees. And that's what's happening right now as their coastal communities get ripped apart. They feel like they're being left out of the equation. And there's a lot of people up there who also need help as they're having to adapt to a changing Arctic region. So again, back to our voyage. This is ornithologist George DeVoke, living 30 miles off the coast of Alaska at Point Barrow on Cooper Island. He's beginning his 5th decade of research there, studying a little bird called the black guillemot. He lives in that little cabin there for almost 5 decades. He used to live in the little yellow tent until polar bears started swimming to the island and trying to eat him. The highest point on the island is 3 feet. It's 1 by 3 miles. And this is where he lives. And this is the little bird he studies. And I'll tell you just a little brief story about this bird. He had been studying them for 2 decades, and he finally started noticing that they were picking up on a new signal, and the breeding season was being extended by 5 days per decade, and he didn't understand what had happened. So he started looking at whatever signal they were picking up, and what he found was that the ice was melting and receding 5 days earlier per decade off the coast of Alaska. So he didn't go there to study climate change. He went there to study a bird species, but this little bird taught him about climate change happening in real time in the Arctic, a very powerful story. And of course, he'd never seen polar bears in 28 years, and as the ice started to recede, the polar bears were swimming to the island, and they were hungry. And so they started eating the birds and the eggs and started trying to eat George. And that's when he moved into the cabin. So if you ask George if he believes in climate change, he says, no, you don't believe in climate change. It's just science. It's happening, but I do believe in polar bears. So something's changing, and what's changing, of course, is that they're losing ice quickly, and again, it fell off his chart, and the ice and snow receding and melting off the coast of Alaska. This is me up in the spreader. That's where I usually was, photographing and trying to direct and find open leads through the ice. We did have a little ice in 2009, enough to give us just a little test of about 60 miles through Amundsen Gulf. And stopping in little communities again, we met Inuit hunter and fisherman Wayne Thrasher. I spent a lot of time with him and heard a lot of stories, great stories, and earned his trust, especially as he made his bipsy, which is raw whitefish and beluga whale with a lot of guts and oil. And every once in a while, he would dip his knife down in there and hand it to me, and I'd have to suck it off the knife and try to swallow it. And he loved my gag reflex and thought that was hilarious. So I earned his trust and finally started taking some photographs, and therefore got to go to the ice cave. So this is a permafrost ice cave. This is below the Arctic Ocean. This is 30 feet below the ocean. This is permafrost. This is what it looks like. And it's frozen ocean, basically. And there's 19 caves there. Each family has a place to store their food, and that's where he was collecting his food for his family for the winter. So he told me lots of oral histories dating back thousands of years about how the Inuit migrated throughout the region from Greenland all the way into Siberia. So it was really fascinating, and that's been backed up now by DNA testing. So it's a great time spending time with indigenous people there in the north. Just like in 2007, we made it through the Northwest Passage. We had a little open pack ice that was not a problem. Again, 24/7 light. We carried extra fuel just for this time, so we had open weather windows where we could motor through the open ice flows, meeting other sailors like these 2 Brits in the 17-foot open boat. You can see they have on flip-flops and Crocs. It was 28 degrees, and they had just had an incident with a bear. So they were laughing, thought it was a great time. They were on holiday from the war in Afghanistan. They were special ops guys from the British Special Forces. And our writer there, Herb McCormick from Cruising World, said that he was so impressed with these guys. He said if these 2 were in charge of the British Empire, there would still be one. They were great. So we had a lot of fun. And of course, to me, with all the crazy issues going on in the world and some of the major environmental problems, still to me what it comes down to is photographing the beauty of the planet. And sometimes we forget, we get caught up in all of these tremendous issues that face us, that we live in this wonderful, beautiful world, which is a gift. And for me as a photographer and a visual artist, this is what I really love to do, is get out and photograph the beauty of the planet and share it with as many people as I can to try to inspire them to get involved locally or maybe become the next educator or scientist and explore the world, because it's a beautiful place. It's inspiring to me every single day. Being out here in California in the Bay Area is one of the most beautiful and special places that I've ever been. And I'm just so happy to have been able to be here with you today to share this story that I have. And I'll just close with a thought. I took this photograph as we were done with the Northwest Passage in 2009. We were kind of exiting, going into Baffin Bay. We still needed to cross the Arctic Circle, but it was at that point I realized that we were going to make it, and that this crazy young sailor from Iowa was going to be the first American sailor to do the Northwest Passage in both directions. So I knew something in the world had changed, and for gosh sakes. And I wrote in my journal that I had witnessed the end of an era, Amundsen's era, Shackleton, Nansen, all of these great golden era explorers that we know of. This era had kind of come to a close, and a new era had just begun. And that era is the study and change of the Earth's climate systems. And for me as a sailor now, and many other sailors, we feel that we're in this new era of discovery, where it's not good enough to just go out there and cross an ocean. If we're crossing an ocean, we need to be studying. We need to be a citizen scientist. We need to be concerned about our oceans and conservation and be compassionate about it and share these stories. And Mary and I and many others would like to enlist more and more sailors and give them the kind of equipment and technology they need to be acquiring data which we can all use to help save our oceans and planets and work together more collaboratively on these efforts. So with that, I want to thank you very much for having me here today, and I would be honored to take some questions. Thank you. Usually I bring the cold with me. This time I just brought the rain.
Wonderful. Very, very fun that you would spend as much time with us, for goodness sakes, where we have a pretty good view, but nothing like what we've seen. What percent of the time are you spend sailing versus powering when you're on your voyages?
I'd have to say that anytime we could sail, we would sail, but in the Arctic, what happens in the summertime is there's usually a big high pressure that lodges in up there, and you get a lot of these calm days, and you kind of plan your weather windows based on the calm days, because the ice flows will part or pull off the shoreline, or you can use a windy day to open up a lead or whatever to maybe sail. But you get a lot of wind changes in the channels. So I would say probably half the time we were sailing, half the time motoring, or maybe 60% of the time motoring.
With ice moving around, how good are the charts?
The charting there in many cases goes all the way back to Franklin and some of these sailors, because the bottom changes. It's very shallow, and ice can move around the bottoms there and create sandbars and shoals all over the place. In fact, one of those instances almost took Amundsen out. If you've read his accounts, they went aground very hard and had to shed a lot of their gear in order to get off one of those shoals before they got to Joe Haven. So it's a very treacherous place to try to sail. The bottom is changing, and you just sort of have to be very, very cautious and understand if you get off the main route, you may go aground.
So talk about how deep is it when it's really deep? How shallow? It could obviously get shallow enough for you to go aground.
Well, it's funny because I always talk about that Lake Okoboji in Iowa is deeper than most of the water we were sailing in. No kidding, because you have an extended continental shelf off the coast of Alaska, so many times we were sailing in 40 feet of water, and the water's not very deep until you get out to both ends of the Northwest Passage. That's when you finally get back into the deep water and more blue water sailing. But if you get pressed against the shore of northern Alaska in the Arctic, you will go aground. There are no places to go run and hide unless you have a retractable keel, because to get into any of these areas, it's about maybe 3 to 8 feet of water in many cases.
What did you see in terms of tidal effect? Is it real minimal?
Very, very little.
Like inches or?
Yeah, maybe a foot. But the big problem that they have there, because of the shallow water, these act almost like lakes or basins, in that water can get pushed over days, especially without the ice. So if the wind blows for 3 days or so, the water will get pressed and pushed. So when you do have a small tidal change, with that surge plus the wave action, that's what's causing a lot of the problems in communities.
So how much time of all your time has been north and versus the Antarctica? How much have you spent in the North Pole region? And
Mostly north, and that's where I've really centered my basis of my work. Antarctica is fascinating, but I'm telling you, we got hammered down there so bad on our first trip. Roger said that we had more heavy weather during that voyage than he had in his entire career. Seriously, we had just wind after wind after wind. In fact, we had 7 low pressure systems within 600 miles of us when we were down there around the Antarctic Circle in trouble. So we didn't have anywhere to go. There was no bailout in any direction whatsoever. So when you're down there, you're really alone. And the only person that we had at the time was a ham radio operator from Palmer Station. He was our only lifeline to the rest of the world.
how much fuel would you keep on the boat, and how often, and where could you get more fuel when you needed it?
We couldn't get any fuel in Antarctica whatsoever. And by the way, I was in charge of the recycling program. Every single piece of anything that we took down to Antarctica, we brought back to dispose of properly because they don't have any services there. So you're really self-contained. We didn't have a water maker. We had 400 gallons of water divided between 6 people for about 6 weeks. Our only female crew member, who was a Northwest Airlines stewardess, long time employed there, had sailed a lot over the years, and she lost 22 pounds in 6 weeks, and literally was moving around the boat and sleeping with a bucket tied to her waist. So it was a really rough time.
In terms of plastic and junk that you saw, where did you see the most of it? And in the water table, how is it distributed? Is lots at the bottom, at the top? Where do you see it?
What happens is plastic decays over time at the surface with the UV penetration, and it sort of rots into fine particles. And I really didn't understand it too well until around the Americas voyage, when we spent some time at Scripps with the scientists there. And they gave us little bottles full of the plastics, and I was imagining more of the big tarps and tennis shoes and big plastic pieces out there, but they're fine particles. And there's also a lot of plastic grocery bags, and those look like jellyfish, of course, and sea turtles and such go grab those bags, and then they get plastered all over their faces and in them. But there's a lot of fine particles, and as they break down, they move down into the water column and get distributed. And Mary can probably address that a little further, but they're basically distributed in small particles and microbeads all the way down to the bottom of the ocean. So that's really the problem, is that we can skim the surface for the big plastics. And that's definitely something that we need to address immediately, and especially these ghost nets, which are the leftover fishing gear that's either cut away or lost at sea. And these just continue to collect and collect and collect, and they become monstrous in size. And there's a whole ghost net initiative that's in place right now trying to deal with these, but it's a huge problem in trying to collect them. And this is why we need data points. We need to find where these are located and get the fleets out there to start dealing with getting these out of the oceans and trying to recycle them.
What are you eating on board, and how much storage can you have for food on the boat?
On Cloud 9, we didn't have a lot. We just had a traditional fridge and small freezer. And then we had, different layers of food all the way down into the bilge. And of course, irradiated milk and all that kind of stuff that you can get. On Ocean Watch, we had a big freezer, and of course, we went to the Costco food store, and when we left Seattle, and really loaded up. And the biggest incident we had on Ocean Watch was when we ran out of butter in the Arctic. That really created a problem, because you crave high-calorie, dense-calorie foods with a lot of fat, like lots of butter, lots of peanut butter, honey, and glob it between 2 pieces of bread or a cracker and just eat to stay warm. You really, really need that, because the energy required to do an expedition in the cold is really demanding on the body. And I might add, as far as speaking of body changes, it's really hard to be on a boat for a year. it takes a tremendous toll on your body. I was hospitalized in Boston with some potential blood clotting, and you become very prone to problems that you don't get when you're moving around on land. So it's a big commitment to go out to sea for a long, long time, and it's fishing, of course, along the way, too. Always nice when somebody would catch a fresh fish.
So what's the difference? I know you spent more time in the north, but what do you notice is the difference in the weather patterns on the top of the Earth and the bottom of the Earth?
Well, they behave differently because the North Pole is the Arctic Ocean, and so it's frozen seawater. So a lot of people ask me the question about, well, what about the sea level rise from losing all this ice from the North Polar melt? That's not affecting sea level rise at all. It's already frozen seawater, so it's just going to melt back into frozen seawater, or into water. So now at the other end of the world, you have 2-mile thick ice on a continent, so it's 10,000 feet thick. And around the edges, you have these great big ice sheets. And of course, we're watching the Western Atlantic ice sheet, what's called the WAIS. And these different ice sheets are suspended with sort of mechanisms that are failing right now because the warming oceans are undercutting these big plates of ice. And this is not frozen ocean. This is from snow and ice that's accumulated over the eons. And when this goes into the water, it can raise sea level by feet, and 10, 12, 20 feet. And that's what's happening in Greenland right now. So they behave differently. Warming ocean is melting the ice in Antarctica from underneath the ice sheets, okay? Even though the freshwater melt is creating more surface ice. So you'll hear Antarctic ice is increasing. That's because ice freezes at different temperatures, and freshwater ice around the edges is frozen, increasing surface ice. So what's going to happen and what is happening right now is that the polar vortex, the jet stream that circumnavigates the Arctic, is being destabilized. And that's what's affecting, that's why we're having extreme weather patterns develop quickly, with it being sub-zero and snow in the east and record high temperatures in Alaska. So you're having a jet stream that's wobbling. And that's one of the things that happened in Houston with all the rain, with the 52 inches, is that the jet stream was weakened, and that steering mechanism that would have pushed that hurricane back offshore and deflect it back to the east was weakened, and then it just rained and rained and rained. So that's why these extreme weather systems are happening and developing, and with the 4% more water vapor in the atmosphere, these extreme rain events will continue.
So back on food, so how many calories are you taking in a day? What's it like?
I would say sometimes, 4,000, 6,000 calories,
Okay.
As much as you can put in your body.
And what about energy generation on the boat? Solar is, you had a
Yeah,
low
we
angle. How do
we
you do
had we had solar on Ocean Watch and wind. We didn't have on Cloud 9. In fact, we had a very old Mercedes-Benz diesel engine that barely functioned. So it was just enough to keep us going. We didn't have a functioning generator on Cloud 9 at the time.
So Ryan, would you use this microphone, hold it up, and if you have a question, hold up your hand, and Ryan will bring you this mic. So as I see questions out among you in the audience, I'm happy to hand
We did have a water maker on our 2007 voyage, didn't we, Doug? On Cloud 9, did we finally have a water maker? No, we still hauled. Roger never got a water maker. Did we have a manual one? We didn't even have a backup manual one. So we had 400 gallons of water that we had to manage, basically.
Yeah.
Something like that.
I wanted to ask what months you were in Antarctica where you got all that terrible weather. Do you remember?
Height of the summer, January. It was just brutal. We had 40 to 70 knots continuous, and we had numerous icebergs all around us with visibility of about 500 feet. And literally, if you lifted your head up above the Dodger without a pair of goggles on, it would rip your face off. It would be pretty much like standing in front of a sandblaster. That was the conditions that we faced out there. We lost our storm sail. lost a lot of instrumentation, and as I say, we basically sailed into Palmer Station with compass and telltales.
So, Di, would you bring up the lights in the room, and around the room, those of you who know how to do it, pull up the shades.
But yeah,
pull up the
January
shades
weather.
up.
So normal summer weather in Antarctica changes very, very quickly, and storms develop fast.
So, Di, you can get somebody in the cloakroom to bring up the lights. Thanks, buddy. Question in the back. Bill's got a question. Bill, be it loud. Maybe we can hear you.
You didn't specifically answer Ron's question about
No.
how much fuel you carry. You had all that motoring you were doing. How much did you carry, and how did you carry it?
We actually had extra fuel drums.
Okay, the
the
question-
question was. Oh, go ahead.
The question was, how much fuel did you carry all the time? How did you store it on the boat?
On Cloud 9, we had our regular fuel tank. Do you remember on Cloud 9, Chris? 400 around. We had 2 fuel drums in the cockpit. Yeah, so we had literally our cockpit was full of fuel drums, so we barely had any place to even maneuver aboard Cloud 9. Now, Ocean Watch was refit, so we carried extra fuel, and we had upwards of 600 gallons.
The pictures up north all seemed so mild. What's the most wind you saw up there, most wave you saw up there? And the same question for the south.
Yeah, we didn't really have whenever we had a lot of wind, we were in a protected harbor, so we really planned weather windows where we would travel, and that's why we carried the extra fuel, because we didn't want to be out there in a lot of wind, because that's what brings the ice in on top of you. So you try to get from A to B. When you get to B, you really take a good look at the next weather window and figure how you can get the next 300, 400 miles in somewhat mild weather. But you have to take a look at the ice charts as to which way the wind had been blowing and where the leads are potentially going to open up. And that's an advantage of the era that we live in now, because you can get that kind of information very easily through the internet from the Canadian Ice Service.
John, you've got a question? No. Okay. While he's getting the mic over, let me ask, what's the most danger you saw? What kind of danger was it?
The danger is different in all places, and the Northwest Passage in both directions has different dangers. So from the western side, the danger is more when you get back out to the east, because you're going to start seeing at night, and you're back into pack ice and iceberg territory. So there's a tremendous number of icebergs in Baffin Bay and down toward Davis Strait, and now it's dark. So you have to have good functioning radar. You have to have eyes on all the time, and you probably have to slow down or heave to during the night. On the other side of the equation, you're going into the fall in both the Bering Sea and down into the Gulf of Alaska, which can be really rough. And we actually had some pretty rough sailing. What do we have, 60 knots?
Yeah, when we crossed the Gulf of Alaska.
Yeah,
that was the worst part of the trip that I wasn't looking forward to.
It was,
We're
and
getting into October, and that's when the gales really start blowing.
that was kind of unexpected.
I think it's blowing 60, 65. We had 25
We had
foot seas.
big following seas. In fact, I remember being at the wheel, and Chris told me not to turn around. No, he said, you don't want to see this, David. You don't want to see it. But, we had, 40 to 60 knots sort of in that territory. The same thing in around Davis Strait and in Baffin Bay in the autumn time. Now, you don't have to worry about the ice in the Bering Sea, but there's ferocious winds in that part. In Antarctica, of course, we had anywhere from 40 to 60 knots in that ice that we were in, and then we had 105 knots of wind at Cape Horn on Ocean Watch, and we were lucky to get into a hurricane hole about 17 miles from Cape Horn and just kind of survive.
How big of waves did you see or sail in?
I would, everybody's got different ideas, but I'd say probably 40, 45 feet.
And so what are you doing in that case? Your bare poles and
No,
what are you doing?
mostly very, very small sail and heaving to. Roger liked to heave to with a with a double reef mizzen and a storm sail, or sometimes even just a mizzen, and we could pretty much ride out almost anything. But there were some times that we got hit hard with sails up, and we had to clear the deck and lash the wheel, and that was the night that the New Zealand boat got dismasted out there in 80 knots in Drake,
Ken, if you have a-
Drake Passage. Mm-hmm.
If you have a question, hold your hand up, and John will pass the mic.
Got the mic? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
What, I know it's been a few years since you've done this, but what are the outside resources that are available? I'm interested in possibly trying to attempt this in 2020. And you mentioned the Canadian Ice Authority. What about satellite images, the current electronics, that sort of thing?
Yeah, you can get a lot from NASA and NOAA. There's Alaskan Resources. Douglas Pohl. Is it Douglas Pohl? Is that his last name? I'll send you the website, but he has a Northwest Passage blog and pretty much tracks every boat that's going through there. I would definitely go to the Canadian Ice Service for all of their ice charts. They're unbelievable. They're fantastic, way better than I think U.S. resources, and more helpful. Other sailors. Basically, I have a lot of websites and links from other sailors who have gone through before, and resources within the last 6 or 7 years that I'd just be happy to share, for sure. And there's a lot of books and articles just being written within the last 10 years. In 2012, I think there were 32 boats or something that went through the Northwest Passage. So just in the last few years, there's been more and more articles and books that have been written where you can go to. And Willie DeRoos and Willie Waugh is just still one of the most tremendous resources around for, he was the first small boat really that ushered in the sailing small boat era in 1977 to go through the Northwest Passage. And he, to me, is one of the great sailing heroes of our time. So I would definitely read that book.
What size crew do you like? And do you have a watch system, and we have roles defined?
We had 2 different watch schedules. We sort of argued a bit about the watch schedule on Ocean Watch before we settled into 4 on, 4 off, but we really only had 4 sailors, and it worked okay for us. Roger had the old Navy system and preferred 6 people, and I still like that one where you're 4 on and 8 off. So in a 24-hour cycle, you do 2 watches, and you bump the watch schedule every 2 hours so that you have 2 different partners. That way you can relay information properly to the rest of the crew. And of course you keep great logs so that you can refer to the log and you can see the changes immediately in wind direction and pressure and barometric pressure and observations that are going on. So Roger was very meticulous about that, and that's why he was so successful. And I have always carried that with me. And Mark Schrader was the captain of Ocean Watch, and he was very much the same way. But they were different people to work with because Mark Schrader was a solo sailor. He came out of, he did the first ever solo around the world doing the Great Southern Capes. And
Great sailor.
Great sailor. But he didn't like to stop. That's the problem with solo sailors. It's like they just want to keep going. And I like to stop and talk to people. And in fact, Mark Schrader, when he described me at the end of the voyage, and I'm greatly honored for this, he said that David Thoreson has the ability to start a conversation up with a fence post. And I consider that one of the highest honors I've ever received. But, you have to. You get off the boat. You got to find water. You got to find fuel. You got to find the place to eat. And where you guys can sort of regroup and make some friends along the way. So that was part of my role too. Was to do that.
I resemble that remark. So hunting and fishing.
Hunting and fishing. Yeah.
Talk about what you catch on the way and what % of your food it is.
Oh, when we were sailing in the Atlantic and Pacific, Dave Logan was our fisherman aboard, and he was the first mate on Ocean Watch. So he liked to fish, and every once in a while he would bag a nice big something, mahi or whatever it may be, tuna. We didn't do a lot of fishing on, especially on the Northwest Passage voyage. You're just really focused. It's it's dangerous also, and unless you're stopped. And in fact, the fishing thing, I kind of got over it a little bit when one of our friends, Helmut Maurer, we sailed across the Atlantic a few years ago on Cloud 9, and he had hooked a big Spanish mackerel, and he was trying to bring it in over the stern, and he absolutely insisted on bringing the fish up himself that he caught. So Gaff brought it up. The gaff went through the fish's head and hooked him in the calf, and he split his calf wide open from his ankle almost to his knee, hooked an artery, and we're standing there with 6 of us with blood squirting about 10 feet in the air, and I pretty much got over the fishing thing then. When we had to put 38 stitches in him out at sea. This was before, again, modern communication. And so we were communicating back to the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota through a ham radio operator in Zimbabwe or something. And so we became a triage class for the doctors at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and they were advising us on what to do with our patient out at sea, how to treat him. And because it would have cost something of $250,000 or more to get him off the boat at that point.
You can't get away from the Midwest. For goodness
Can't
sake.
get away from the Midwest.
Wyman, you've got a question.
You don't talk about this as a particularly great vacation spot. Though, my wife keeps talking about making a Northwest Passage on some sort of an adventure cruise ship.
Sure.
And is that something that's realistic? And or should I go home and really discourage her?
I would not discourage, but if I was going to do it, I would try to do it on one of the bigger research vessels, icebreaking research vessels, or one of the icebreakers like the Klebnikov or something like that, versus the great big cruise ships. The Crystal Serenity went through there 2 years ago, maybe last year also. They were the first big cruise ship to ever go through. I read some of the blogs from some of the passengers, and they were very disappointed because they said there's nothing to see and nothing to do. And that's true, especially on the western side. Pretty low country, not any mountains or anything like that to see, and it's foggy. A lot of times you're just going through the fog, and there's not tremendous sightseeing, and the towns are dry in the Canadian Arctic. So if you want to go into a town and try to have some fun, you're probably going to get arrested by the Mounties and cause a big disturbance in the force up there. Like the Wild Vikings and Berserk did on our 2007 voyage when they all got arrested and deported from Canada for going into town and causing trouble drinking and stuff. So there's not a lot to do. There's no infrastructure. And you better have good medical supplies on the vessel because there's not really any hospitals or clinics available for passengers, and there really are no amenities or tourism infrastructure at this point set up. So if you're doing that kind of voyage, it's going to be to do the Northwest Passage, not necessarily to have a tremendous amount of fun on shore. I would highly suggest Greenland. There's direct flights right now to Ilulissat, to Jakobshavn, and that's where the great big glacier that I showed in the picture is, and it's tremendous beauty there in these communities, and you can take a ferry from town to town. So country 2/3 the size of the United States with 50,000 people and wild country to explore.
Shelley has a question.
Could you tell us about your book?
Oh, my book is a new book, Over the Horizon. I figured before I went back out to sea again sometime soon, I needed I needed to do, of course, this is my wave shot from the Arctic, and it was very nice that David Rockefeller wrote the foreword for me, and Herb McCormick wrote my introduction. It's I didn't know what to call it, so I was calling it kind of a pictorial autobiography or something, and Herb called it a pictorial memoir, so that's what I'm calling it. And I just figured that I needed to get this collection of stories into a book with photographs and my journal entries before either something happened to me or I went off to sea and started a whole new collection of stories. So I felt like I was at a great point for a body of work, so I spent the last couple of years putting this book together. And of course, I had about 200,000 photographs to go through to pick the 300 or so that are in this book. And I had, near 1,000 pages of journal entries. So it was really hard to put together. And as you saw just from my slideshow there, it's any one of these things I could do a whole program on. And that's why I enjoy doing this so much, and why sometimes I get a little bit off track, because there's a lot of stories and a lot of memories, a lot of good friendships. Chris and Doug have many of these same memories ingrained in them now. And so I do have a few books here. I only brought 6. My wife, Kirsty, can handle any sales if you'd like. Otherwise, you can go to my website, davidthorson.com, and I'd be happy to sign and personalize a book for you and send it here to California, and I'll even offer free shipping, so it's just like you would get it here at the event. So,
Talk
anyway.
about the Indians, Inuits and so on.
Yes.
What's their lifestyle like? What's your interaction with them like?
Yeah, I was talking with Doug before this event a little bit, and this is why I'm so excited about going back this summer and getting on the land, because as a sailor, when you're going through the Northwest Passage, you're in these villages, you meet people, and you're really ships passing during the night. And they're a little bit wary of you anyway. And so it takes time to build friendships and trust, and there wasn't a lot of time to do that, and that's something that if I have any regret from the Arctic, that's my biggest regret, is that I didn't have enough time with the native people. So I've, in the last 6 years or so, been developing relationships with the Gwich'in community in the Canadian side of things, and also with the Inupiat people and leaders in some of the communities. So this summer when I go back, I will be interviewing many elders in the community and getting their feel about fossil fuel development, oil and gas that's coming because the ice is melting and there's going to be development there. We can't stop it. It's coming to the Arctic. And so I want to get their feelings about it, and also about how they're adapting to the changes and what they're seeing more their lives. I already know that small boat adventures are getting very scary up there because there's less ice to buffer their small boats. So there's bigger wave action now, and there's smaller weather windows in which to operate in the Arctic. So they're putting their families at risk every time they go out to hunt and fish. Many of the ice caves, like I showed there in Tuktoyaktuk, are now melting because the permafrost is melting. So they're losing their natural refrigeration, which causes them to switch more toward a Western diet, which is also causing terrific health problems, like diabetes and obesity and all kinds of problems, because their diets have never been geared that way before. So they're seeing tremendous community changes and cultural losses right now. And that's why I want to make sure from a conservation standpoint that we all kind of work hard to make sure that these resources, natural resources, remain available to them so that they can keep their cultures intact.
So last question, are you restricted in terms of government, any governments keeping you from going anywhere in the North Pole? We hear about Russia wanting to own big pieces of the North Pole. Talk about that.
Yeah, this is a terrific question. There's always been the question of sovereignty of the Northwest Passage, and still to this day, in fact. The Norwegian boat up there, as I refer to, Berserk, they did not respect the sovereignty of the Canadian government at all in any manner whatsoever. And they viewed it as an international passageway, and they had every right to do whatever they wanted to within it. I disagree with that. I think that it's Canadian territory, and the Canadians have done a very good job of managing this and allowing boats to pass through, as long as you follow some pretty basic rules. And I think as long as everybody does this and abides by this, then the passageway will remain open for all of us to enjoy in future generations, and that's what I hope will happen with the Northwest Passage. Now, the North Pole is another animal. The Russians planted a flag at the bottom of the ocean the North Pole claiming it for Russia. So we're going to see a lot of issues. They just opened a very advanced military base on the Northeast Passage side of the equation. And in an ironic twist of history and fate, it's the Northeast Passage that is the navigable sea route through the North Polar region, what's called the Northern Sea Route. And the Russians are equipped and ready for it. They've built 40 ice-reinforced and polar vessels, huge icebreakers with nuclear-powered engines, and some of them are equipped with military weaponry, and they are ready for this new era. And that's why I talk about this Northwest Passage being so important to Americans, because we are one of the Arctic nations. We need to sign the Law of the Sea Treaty. We need to be involved in managing the Arctic, and we have 2 old icebreakers. We aren't building new ships. We have no advanced base in the north. We have no deep water port. And in this time of climate change, with the melting of the ice, we need to be involved in the Arctic because it's really an important strategic area for us to continue to be involved in. And that's why I say none of this is a political issue to me. It's just something that we need to be aware of and be involved in and move it forward.
So I want to thank the CCA and Bill Foss as the Rear Commodore these days, and Bob Hinault. It's great to have a joint meeting of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon and the CCA. Thank you very much, David. Great talk. Appreciate it.
Thank you all
so
very,
much.
very much. Thank you.
Thanks, folks.